This is my randomology, and today we're going to find out everything there is to know about Dracula worth knowing. Please excuse my voice sounding a little off. I'm just getting over something. It being October, I really wanted to talk a little bit about horror literature, and what better way to start than with Dracula, one of the quintessential horror texts. Now, while Dracula did popularize the idea of a vampire, and today it's kind of the quintessential vampire story, it was not the first vampire story in literature. In European mythology, at least in the 19th century, a vampire was closer to what today we would think of as either a zombie or a ghoul. In the modern world, why did this lead to dozens of Hammer movies? Why did it lead to, hundreds of adaptations across film and television, comic books, unauthorized sequels, everything? We've got everything from comedies to action to whatever the hell Twilight was doing. Vampires are still popular. And it really did start with Dracula. And there's a very good reason for that. When you think of a vampire, you probably think of something that is coming to suck your blood and maybe turn you into a vampire as well. Primarily, though, the threat of a vampire is the vampire wants to eat you, right? That is the danger. It's a monster that feeds on humans. And that's also what Dracula did. But that's not all that he was doing. To the Victorians, Dracula actually represented what's called an existential threat. Now, this is very different from just a physical, threat as most of us would understand it. The vampires, for example, in 30 Days of Night, which is a fantastic movie and comic book if you've never experienced them, they are very much a physical threat. They are feral. They're a lot closer to, a shark or something that is just feeding. They want you for your blood and your meat. Now, they represent a savage physical threat, but not an existential threat, which is the thing that really separates Dracula and other subsequent vampires from things like the 30 Days of Night vampires. Now, those are scary. They are very well done. But an existential threat is a different kind of threat. An existential threat is one which threatens not just the physical being of something, but the very essence of what that thing is. This is something that you saw a lot in something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. When somebody gets turned into a vampire, the person is technically still there, but their soul is gone. The essence of what was the person has now been replaced by something which is usually a mockery or the reversal of what the original victim represented. That's what made Dracula so alluring, but also so frightening to the Victorian audience when the book was published. Dracula represented a threat not just physically to Victorian men and women, but he represented a threat to the very essence of what it meant to be a Victorian. And this happens from the get-go, from the very first chapters. When Jonathan Harker is going to Transylvania in order to meet Dracula, he describes Transylvania as a place where myth and legends and nightmares are from, which is supposed to set it apart from England, which is supposed to be an industrial nation, rational, things like, legends and superstitions are supposed to be dead in England. Not so in Transylvania. In Transylvania, magic and superstition still reign supreme. By virtue of simply existing, Dracula is representing a threat to the idea that science has pushed away, this idea of, fairies and ghosts and things like that. He is a contradiction to the idea that the scientific revolution can help explain everything. But Dracula also threatens the Victorians in a lot of different ways. One of the first things that we see is that he lives with a couple of ladies, and their living arrangement is, shall we say, unorthodox. While they're traditionally called the Brides of Dracula, the text itself never really calls them that. The one name that kind of comes up most often is the Weird Sisters. Weird in the sense of strange, not weird as in wacky. But the living arrangement is very much one which is hinted to be sexual, which of course contradicts the idea of, a man and a woman living together and making a family. This arrangement is not something that the Victorians would ever condone publicly. In looking at Victorian society, it really bears to remember that there's the public part, and then there's the thing that they actually did behind the scenes. The Victorians were not really prudes so much as they wanted to put forth a facade of I don't know exactly what the word would be. They wanted to seem, legitimate. They wanted to seem, upright. They wanted, well, upright. And there's a joke in there somewhere. But what I'm trying to get at is that behind the scenes, the Victorians really were not as prudish as we think they were today. But this was all stuff that happened behind the scenes, behind closed doors. It's not the kind of thing that you talked about in polite society, whatever the hell that means. So when Jonathan Harker arrives in Transylvania and sees Dracula and the Weird Sisters in this living arrangement, it's automatically something that would be scandalous if he were back home. But for Dracula, this is exactly this is what life is.
Mark me down as scared and horny.
Not just when it comes to marriage, but the Weird Sisters also represent the opposite of what a woman was expected to be in Victorian times. Now, to get a good contrast as to what that means, you need look no further than the character of Mina, which is Jonathan's fiance/wife later. The novel goes out of its way to paint Mina as a traditional woman. Her relationship with Jonathan would not be out of place in, an Emily Bronte novel. It's almost sickeningly sweet, the way that these two love each other and the relationship that they portray. Very traditional male and female roles. But the women who become vampires, starting with the Weird Sisters and then later Lucy, very much usurp that idea of what a woman should be, what femininity is. In Victorian times, a woman is supposed to be, married, a wife, a mother, loving, nurturing. When a woman becomes a vampire, however, they become the complete opposite of that. The Weird Sisters are not averse to hunting children. Lucy, when she gets turned later in the novel, does the same thing. She specifically targets children, which makes her the complete opposite of, again, what a woman should be in Victorian times.
She's Nosferatu. She's Italian? No, it means the undead. She's cursed to spend eternity in misery, hunting the living like a wild animal.
In choosing his victims, Dracula, yes, he will go after women, most famously after Lucy and after Mina. But when he goes after Jonathan early in the novel, there's a very homoerotic subtext to the way that all of that happens as well. So as the Weird Sisters are feeding on Jonathan and Dracula does the same thing, Jonathan is very much emasculated in this. He becomes weak, he becomes compliant, he becomes all the things that a man should not be according to Victorian custom. Kind of like how the women become everything they're not supposed to be by targeting children and becoming feral and sexual. And right here you can really start to see how Dracula becomes a threat not just to the physical well-being of people, but to the very institutions that Victorian society was based on. Women become sexual feral beasts and men become very compliant and weak. Dracula is undoing these things, so he's showing that they can be undone, that they're not something that is eternal or standard or normal, something that can just withstand whatever is thrown at it. No, Dracula is undoing the very fabric of society in what he does. And Dracula's entire plan, by the way, is not to just sneak into London and do all this stuff. No, the man is buying property in London. He is moving in. In essence, what he does is he's colonizing England. This is actually kind of a joke when it comes to science fiction. When aliens invade or when there's a monstrous force at work, worldwide, or there's a threat to the status quo. It's basically the kind of thing that a lot of powers already did to a lot of native populations. Except it's European or European adjacent cultures experiencing it.
Well. How the turntables...
Towards the second half of the novel, when Mina Harker is actually bitten, all of the men focus on saving Mina. Mina kind of becomes a symbol for the purity of femininity, for what a woman should be. And in saving her, they're not just saving her, but this idea of what a woman should be. In trying to save Mina from turning into a vampire, we also get a revisit of this idea of science versus superstition with the character of Van Helsing. Now, Van Helsing is, in fact, a doctor. He's a philosopher. He's kind of he knows a lot of different things. But his approach to this is to chastise the men for not being willing to accept the idea that the supernatural, that magic, might actually be real. Now, the very interesting thing about this is that Dracula, at least to my knowledge, and I might be wrong on this, is probably one of the more prominent examples of 19th century literature, or probably early horror fantasy, where this idea of the supernatural encountering the modern world gets really explored. Now, today we have a whole genre that has to do with this called urban fantasy. Probably one of my favorite examples of what urban fantasy is like is the famous episode from Buffy the Vampire Slayer where they're up against the demon who, prophecy says no weapon forged of man may kill, or something like that. And they realize that this prophecy is not necessarily prophetic so much as it is descriptive. I mean, this demon was bound and shackled and put away thousands of years ago when something like steel and bronze were cutting-edge technology, and they realized, well, maybe we need to up our game. And so what do? They hit it with an anti-tank missile, and that pretty much does the job.
What's that do?
Dracula is actually an early example of something like this. When Van Helsing approaches the problem, he does so by opening his mind to the idea that, yes, the supernatural is real, but let's approach it from a scientific mindset. There should be rules to this. It's not arbitrary. What are the rules? What are the things that we need to know in order to fight off this new power? Let's learn it. And one of the things that they end up doing is using Mina's connection to Dracula, I guess a psychic connection you might call it. I'm not sure if the novel actually refers to it as such, but she does have a connection to him, and they use it kind of to spy on him and figure out what he's doing. And at the end of the day, how do they kill Dracula? Do they expose him to the sun? Do they drive a wooden stake through his heart? No, they chop him up with knives. Yeah, that's how Dracula goes out. They cut him up. Which is a final insult to them, actually, and sort of a victory for Dracula as well, because in order to defeat this force, these Englishmen had to resort to barbaric combat. I believe that they actually were using kukris in order to fight Dracula off. So they had to lower themselves to what in their minds would have been a very basic and very savage level. And all of that together is why Dracula was so popular, and why he remains popular to this day, and why I think some of the best vampire stories really explore this thing. Vampires are monsters, but they were human once. And that idea that becoming a vampire, blows the lid off your id, so to speak, that it frees you from societal constraints. It's an idea that gets explored in a lot of vampire fiction. I think Buffy did a pretty good job with it. But it's this idea that the things that we hold dear as far as a society can be undone so quickly that somebody can just kind of flip a switch and turn into the complete opposite of what they were. That's what makes it horrific. That's what makes Dracula an existential threat. A threat, again, not simply to the physical well-being. He's not just going to drain your blood. He's going to turn you into a symbol that represents everything you stood against when you were alive. Now, I'm not saying that I'm against using vampires as just, action monsters and things like that. I love Blade 2. I think Blade 2 is a fantastic movie. Let's pretend that the third one doesn't exist. Underworld, still fun. The sequels, also fun. I have no problem with that. But I really do think that if you want to use vampires in fiction, I think you really need to explore that, because that's what made vampires popular to begin with. The idea that they can usurp a lot of societal expectations. When you really start going down that route, it becomes a lot more interesting, I think. The existential threat of what they become, it could be horrific, but in the right context, it could also, deconstruct things which should be deconstructed. Dracula is and remains one of the most popular monsters for a reason. And if you've never gotten the chance to read the novel, there's free versions online. It's in the public domain. I would highly encourage you to do so. It's not a difficult read. It can be a little bit dry. It's an older novel. It's over 100 years old. But I do encourage you to take a look at it and really look at it with an open mind and really just try to understand why this novel is still popular over 100 years later and why this character has been adapted so many times. It's because he's a very complex character who presents a very complex threat. So that's the lesson, short and sweet. Thank you very much for watching. If you're watching the full version of this, hey, thank you so much. And if you're not watching the full version, you're watching the short one, hey, you can become a member. There's a button right down there. Thank you, and I will see you later.